Chapter 801, Plea Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. After a brief moment of stupefaction, Emlyn couldn't help but look around. He suspected that the world was lurking around him, as though he was one of the nearby believers. After all, he had never mentioned the mental terror candle at the Tarot Club. Bishop Yutravsky seldom had conflicts with others, so he almost never used any mystical items. If it wasn't because Emlyn had been planted with a psychological cue to frequently head to the Harvest Church and received the heads-up from Sherlock Moriarty, he wouldn't have asked the bishop and learned of the existence of the mental terror candle. At that instant, everyone looked like the world to Emlyn. Be it the plump middle-aged man, the granny with a grey headscarf, or the fashionable beauty, he felt that all of them looked like they had something similar to the world. No, I must figure it out. He's actually so aware of my surroundings. I haven't mentioned certain things even while in front of Mr. Fool. Emlyn was left in utter shock as he stood up and walked to the clergyman's break room at the back. In a quiet and empty environment, he replied, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to directly communicate with the world." In less than 10 seconds, Emlyn saw a dark red glow surge forward like a tidal wave and devour him. Then, he found himself back above the grey fog. He was inside the majestic palace and was seated at his seat. And at the other end of the model table was the blurry figure of the world who was waiting for him. Compared to before, Emlyn had changed tremendously. He wasn't in a rush to speak to the world, and he instead bowed to Mr. Fool, who was leisurely watching at the other end of the table, before looking at his target. "How did you know that I can get the mental terror candle?" Under Klein's control, the world said with a hoarse laugh, "We might have met before." He didn't speak further and only mentioned the key point. As for whether Emlyn could figure out the situation, that wasn't his problem. Of course, Klein believed that Emlyn lacked the ability to connect the world to Sherlock Moriarty since he lacked the necessary clues. Emlyn frowned bit by bit as he had a few targets of suspicion, but he wasn't able to determine who was the world. "Believe me, I have no ill intentions towards the members of the Tarot Club," the world added when he saw Emlyn in a state of prolonged silence. There will be a day when I'll find you." Emlyn silently muttered to himself as he asked, "What are you going to do with the mental terror candle? I need to have a substantial reason to borrow such a mystical item." Klein controlled his urge to rub his temples as he made the world turn solemn and say, "To treat my psychological problems." Treat psychological problems. Emlyn couldn't help but shrink his body back before straightening it again. Looking back at the world, his eyes clearly indicated that the world really was a dangerous lunatic. The mental terror candle does have such effects, Emlyn thought for a moment and said, "I can only borrow it for half a day. There wouldn't be any problems, right?" Klein held back the horror and pleas that were running through his mind as he controlled the world to answer, "No problem." If the mental terror candle was effective, Klein could finish the problem in 15 minutes. If it wasn't of any use, it would be the same even if he possessed it for days or months. Therefore, the rental duration wasn't critical. He didn't mind such restrictions at all. Emlyn did a count and said, "The rental fee will cost £300, as well as 5 pages of Beyonder Powers in Lamino's Travels." He decided to outsource half of the debt he had. 5 pages. How many pages did this fellow use? As Klein lampooned, he made the world reply, "That wouldn't be an issue." After closing the deal, Emlyn immediately returned to the real world and walked into the Harvest Church's break room for the clergyman. Casting his gaze to the side of the altar and waiting for Bishop Yutravsky to finish talking to the believers, Emlyn suddenly fell into a dilemma. Although he sounded confident in front of the world, he had never tried borrowing similar items from the bishop. He had no idea what kind of attitude the bishop would have. As his gaze darted around, Emlyn subconsciously surveyed the tiny prayer hall. "I've helped Father rescue many commoners who were infected by the plague, and have been teaching those who wish to learn about herbs. I've made the faith of Mother Earth spread quite significantly in this borough. What's wrong with borrowing the mental terror candle for half a day?" Emlyn raised his chin and walked to Bishop Yutravsky, who he needed to look up at, and cleared his throat. I have a friend that has a psychological problem. I wish to borrow the mental terror candle. He didn't directly mention his contributions, because his pride didn't permit him to do so. Yutravsky looked down at the priest-robed Emlyn and smiled warmly. Okay, that's it. Emlyn was stunned, finding it unbelievable that the bishop would agree so easily. He didn't immediately accept it as he couldn't help but ask, "Aren't you afraid that I'll lose the candle?" Yutravsky replied with a smile, "Everyone and every item has its end. They will all return to the earth, buried deep within the soil and sprout, grow, and bloom, one incarnation after another. That is the fate of all entities. If the mental terror candle is lost, it just means that my connection with it has come to an end. I will need to patiently await the arrangements that fate and mother have for me. Whether the mental terror candle is lost depends on fate, but whether I end up being killed by you is also fate." Emlyn lampooned without asking further. He received the strange candle from the half-giant bishop. Following that, he used the excuse of needing to treat his friend to leave the harvest church. He randomly found an inn and set up the sacrificial ritual. Above the gray fog, Klein once again received the mental terror candle. More than half of the mystical item was burnt, and its surface was covered with what looked like human skin. There were a few warts that protruded out. The candle's wick was very short and was entirely black in color. It was covered in thin densely packed scale-like patterns. Klein didn't delay, for he didn't wish to give his alternate personality a chance to grow. He wanted to resolve the problem completely while it was still weak, otherwise, what awaited him was the irreversible fate of losing control. Furthermore, the mysterious space above the gray fog would completely screen the negative effects of the combat between the two personalities. Phew! Klein slowly exhaled as he extended his hand to summon the sea god scepter. At that moment, he didn't do any divination because he couldn't be sure who "me" referred to. The outcome would naturally be meaningless. Pa! Klein snapped his fingers and lit the mental terror candle. Above the pitch-black wick, a flame with light blue spirituality silently glowed, illuminating the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Unknowingly, the environment changed as a cupboard, desk, bunk bed, and gas meter appeared in Klein's eyes. The crimson moonlight shone in from outside the windows, covering every item with a crimson veil layer. This was the apartment where the Morettas had lived in. This was the place where Klein Moretti had shot himself to death. At that moment, a figure was sitting at the bottom bunk, looking at the sea god scepter-wielding Klein with a warped expression. He had traits like black hair, brown eyes, thin built, average-looking features, a rather deep outline, and a scholarly air to him. He was another Klein. This Klein revealed a furious expression as he said, "You occupied my body, and now you wish for my soul to be obliterated? I should be Klein Moretti. You despicable, shameless transmigrator. You parasite." He appeared to have just grown in strength, and he wasn't able to use the objects in the external world. Klein didn't reply as he walked over with a heavy expression. The expression of Klein slowly changed as fear occupied his eyes. His body scrunched up as he pleaded with a slight tremble, "Let me go. Let me go. You snatched my brother, my sister, and my life from me. Isn't that enough? I'll remain quietly in your body, helping you analyze problems and giving you suggestions. I'll definitely not wrestle control with you over the body. Let me go. Let me go." Klein remained silent as he raised his sea god scepter-wielding right hand. The Klein was already awash with tears as he yelled angrily and fearfully, "I only wanted to remind you. If I wasn't trying to remind you, why would I have exposed myself? Let me go. Let me go. I have no ill intentions." Klein silently looked at him and made the blue gems on the tip of the sea god scepter light up one after another. Lightning bolts instantly appeared as they twisted and entangled Klein, like a storm. Amidst shrill cries, the figure rapidly dissipated as a bolt of lightning wiped all traces of it. As expected of myself. To know the soft spots in my heart and which are the most effective ways to plea. However, I've already come to know who I am. I'm Zhou Mingrue who has fused with Klein's memories and emotions. If I were to let you go, it would be equivalent to splitting the two up, admitting that they are opposing parties. That way, I'll immediately lose control once I return to the real world. Klein lowered the scepter and closed his eyes as he sighed silently. Then, he ultimately maintained his lucidity as he left the mind world. Chapter 802, Follow-up Solutions Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. When Klein opened his eyes again, the threats and pleas in his mind had vanished. The light blue flame before his eyes continued burning on that pitch-black wick. He seriously inspected the state of his spirit body and confirmed that the signs of chaos were gone. His aura's colors had turned pure and were no longer spotted. It's finally resolved. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and lowered the sea god scepter. With a snap of his fingers, he extinguished the mental terror candle. He didn't immediately return to the real world. He sat quietly above the gray fog as he used the silent palace to calm the remnant negative emotions that his inner heart couldn't vent. After this matter, Klein gained a deeper understanding that the path of a Beyonder was a path that constantly fought with madness. All Beyonders would be pushed to the brink of losing control, or they would have psychological problems if they weren't careful due to internal reasons or external stimuli. And once the symptoms appeared, not resolving them in time might leave them in a situation that would be abnormally difficult to resolve. The split personality that was created was a result of internal and external factors. The cause is a result of me being a transmigrator. Yet, I fused with Klein Moretti's memory fragments and received parts of his emotions. I was naturally inclined to having a dissociation. Together with me trying to steal the Antigonus family's notebook recently, it's akin to me walking along the boundary of an abyss to act as Dwayne Dantes. The stress is immense, so after being agitated and mentally corrupted by the keeper's near loss of control, the problem erupted. As Klein raised his hand to rub his temples, he vanished from above the gray fog. Just as he returned to his body, Klein felt his mind and spirit were a lot more relaxed. It felt like a dusty window had been carefully wiped clean, and the additional faceless potion he had consumed was fully digested. The alternate personality that appeared is really a result of all the past psychological problems. I was able to resolve the problem with the mental terror candle, which is equivalent to receiving a complete and effective psychoanalysis. I wouldn't have any latent risks in this aspect in the short term. However, I need to be constantly taking notes and frequently regulating myself. I mustn't be careless. Klein walked out of the washroom, came to the balcony, and looked at the distant mountains and nearby vegetation. He was in quite good condition. He could clearly sense that his self-recognition and self-acknowledgement had deepened. The constant sense of disidentification had greatly weakened as a result. I never expected my victory over my split personality would bring such benefits. If it wasn't because the generation of another split personality would result in one that's stronger and harder to deal with, I would have wished to split a few personalities, killing myself several times. Klein shook his head with a scoff as he gave a self-deprecating laugh. To be frank, just one instance of a split personality was rather dangerous and unresolvable for anyone else. Since he was aware of where to acquire the mental terror candle, the essence of the problem, and his experience in resolving it in the past, he was able to eliminate the latent risks and not allow his split personality to strengthen itself. Otherwise, the best outcome would be the state in which Bishop Yutravsky was in, and the worst outcome would be a gradual loss of control until it became an inevitability. Furthermore, I still have a psychiatrist as backup. Klein chuckled as he strolled back to his room and sat in a reclining chair. He recalled what he had encountered during the day, and from there, he obtained the points that he needed to take note of in the future. If a mid-sequence Beyonder of the sleepless pathway loses control, they will be able to directly cause mental corruption by pulling others into a dream. I need to be wary of that in the future. Before becoming a high-sequence Beyonder, the rampagers of most pathways aren't capable of doing this. Often, they will mutate into monsters and use the corresponding Beyonder powers to control or attack their targets. It's difficult for them to transmit their corruption. Apart from the mid-sequence Beyonders from the sleepless pathway, the spectator pathway should be capable of doing so as well. When faced with similar enemies, not rushing to wipe them out would really result in a situation where you have no way of defending yourself. Also, although I'm aware of the Keeper's conditions and have figured out their relationship with the core seal, the corresponding problems have arisen. If I were to disguise myself and infiltrate inside, how should I create the performance of being eroded by the core seal and not have my disguise be seen through? Klein carefully contemplated for a moment and was completely out of ideas. All he could do was stand up, walk to his desk, and draw a picture comprising of symbols that implied secrecy and mystery prying. He was summoning erodes. The full-body mirror in the master bedroom suddenly undulated with invisible waves as silver light appeared, forming Loanese text, "Exalted Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, Erodes, is constantly at your service. My actions from before had caused a certain damage to your image. I am very appalled and ashamed. Will you accept my apology? You actually know to admit your faults." Klein scoffed and said, "Don't make the same mistake again in the future." "All right." The full-body mirror presented new words. "How may I be of service?" "There's something." Klein deliberated and said, "The keepers of the Church of Evernight are contaminated by the core seal's power behind Cheney's gate. They are in different conditions from the typical Beyonder. Is there any way to perfect a disguise?" The silver words changed and outlined new text, "Great Master, there's only one method, to sacrifice your marionette and allow it to receive the contamination of the core seal. It will gradually change and become identical to the keepers. Then, you can hold it in your body to fool the core seal. That actually works. It's an idea. However, a marionette that's made from a sequence 5 wraith can't be bought with money. I really need to pay an extremely high price to obtain the high sequence potion formulas and ingredients." Klein thought and said, "Then, how do I get the marionette to receive the core seal's contamination?" Typically speaking, a wraith marionette might be detected by the seal before being forcefully purified and dispelled just as it approached Cheney's gate, or even just appear in the prayer hall. The full-body mirror's waves stirred again as it accentuated a figure. The figure wore an old-fashioned veiled hat. She was tall with long, chestnut hair. She was none other than Queen Mystic, Bernadette. "Great Master, you can seek her help," Erodes explained with a sentence made from silver words. "Her Queen Mystic isn't from the Evernight pathway. How can she provide any help? Or does she have a sealed artifact that corresponds to the high sequences of the Evernight pathway, making it similar to the core seal behind Cheney's gate? Thankfully, Admiral of Stars needs a drop of blood from a mythical creature. When the time comes, apart from providing an item that can satisfy Wuxia, there's still a middleman fee for me. This will be the middleman fee." Klein thought as he nodded and said, "Very good, you may return." "Yes, exalted Great Master. Your humble servant, Erodes, awaits your next summoning." As a silver line of text appeared, Erodes outlined a palm with a handkerchief in hand as it shook it. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he looked at it, momentarily unsure how to respond. West Borough, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White wore a faint smile as he randomly found a single-seater to sit in the activity room. Diagonally across him, another sanguine baron, Russ Bathory, was holding a wine cup filled with blood. He was observing him with narrowed eyes, without concealing his disgust and hatred. Russ Bathory had not only been injured during the hunt for the first primordial moon believer, but he also had Emlyn steal away his spoils of war. "Such an act from you will only please me." Emlyn chuckled inwardly as he turned his head to look at Cosme Odora who had just entered. He waited for the Baron to declare the results and reward him. Cosme forced himself to ignore Emlyn's gaze as he walked to the fireplace and said to all the sanguine present, "I'm gathering all of you today because the final victor has emerged for the hunting competition. Who is it? The sanguines looked around as they exchanged looks, guessing at who could have clinched victory. Most of their gazes landed on Russ Bathory, with no one believing that it could be Emlyn White. Only Russ Bathory had a hunch as he looked in surprise at the darn fellow. Cosme secretly sighed and said, Emlyn White has already hunted 3 targets, automatically clinching victory. What? A young sanguine blurted out in disbelief. The sanguine was a race with fewer members than humans. In Backlund, they were all part of a smaller community, therefore, they weren't unfamiliar with each other. Everyone knew what kind of sanguine Emlyn was. Chapter 803, Name Rectification Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Amongst all the sanguine present, even if Emlyn wasn't the oddest, he was definitely among the top 10. As a member of a race born with a long lifespan, having one or more hobbies to kill time was common. Emlyn wasn't the only one who liked dolls, but that wasn't the problem. Aside from purchasing new dolls and matching them with new clothes, or obtaining blood from hospitals to drink, he almost never left his home. Nor did he enjoy interacting with his fellow kinsmen. Unless he desired relatively fresh blood, needed to obtain some historical knowledge, or exchange for certain ingredients, he never participated in any of the corresponding gatherings. Such a lifestyle was nearly identical to the aging, high-ranking sanguine who had no choice but to lie in specially made coffins to barely maintain their existence. It looked nothing like that of a fellow who had recently matured. As a result, Emlyn became a topic of idle conversation at many sanguine gatherings. In the years before, people only mentioned it in passing, jeering at him in private, just like the normal gossip about different freaks in Backlund. When they heard that Emlyn walked into the Harvest Church because he got lost and ended up being captured and locked up underground by the Mother Earth's bishop, his reputation slid into the irreversible state of being the brunt of the jokes, as well as being a disgrace to the sanguine. Yet, this disgraceful fellow had hunted 3 consecutive primordial moon believers. Those were artificial vampires. Could it be that he had employed the help of the Church of Mother Earth's clergymen? Or did he hire some especially powerful bounty hunters? Thoughts flashed through the minds of the sanguine as they speculated over how Emlyn had clinched victory. At this moment, Cosme coughed lightly and said, Emlyn has already found the corresponding characteristic legacy and become a baron. Baron. When the members of the sanguine looked at Emlyn again, there weren't any looks of doubt and puzzlement. Instead, their eyes were filled with shock, astonishment, and surprise. For the first time in his life, Emlyn was being stared at by his kinsmen in such a manner. He suddenly felt ethereal as his mind was filled with joy. This made him wish to proudly tip his chin and say, all of you should be addressing me as Lord. This satisfaction is identical to me buying a doll I've been saving up and craving for. Emlyn sighed silently as he held back his tongue. He wore a faint smile as he slowly surveyed the area. Then, while buttoning his coat, he got up and walked to Cosme-Odora's side. After the other sanguines snapped back to their senses as they looked at the 2 barons with mixed looks, Cosme finally said, the champion of the hunting competition will enter the final list of Viscount candidates and obtain free help for the ritual. In addition, he will also receive a ring created by the ancestor. As he spoke, Cosme took out a silver jewelry box engraved with complicated patterns. Snapping it open, he showed it to all the sanguine present. It was a translucent ring that seemed to be made of light red amber. It had a blood-red gem embedded in it. It was the size of a fingernail and it emitted a faint glow. It's called Lilith's ring. It allows the wearer to be even more charming and always be in the optimal state of being under the full moon. Cosme gave a rough introduction. It can also make the surroundings be under the effect of a full moon. Hence, the corresponding beyonder powers will be greatly enhanced. At the same time, it can also project a door that leads deep into the spirit world. Cosme paused and added, this door is the door of summoning. It can let creatures deep in the spirit world use it to arrive in the real world. However, it can only be used once in a fixed amount of time. When spirit world creatures pass through their door, it's equivalent to signing a corresponding contract with the wearer. They will serve the wearer for a specific amount of time, possibly around 5 minutes. If the service period needs to be maintained for even longer, the wearer needs to personally communicate with the spirit world creature to re-sign a contract that's of a longer duration. Under normal circumstances, the strength of the summoned spirit world creature will be equivalent or slightly stronger than the wearer, but there's the possibility of them being much weaker or much stronger. There was once a viscount who relied on this ring to summon a demigod-level spirit world creature. The stronger a spirit world creature's strength, the more they can resist the agreement in the door of summoning contract itself and harm the wearer. If you encounter such a situation, you must decisively dispel the projection and end the summoning. Its negative effects is blood-thirsting disease. You will need to drink at least 1 blood vial of human blood every hour to relieve it. Otherwise, your blood will boil and evaporate. In less than 15 minutes, it can cause the death of a baron. I'm not against that. I do yearn to drink blood more frequently, but the problem is that I'm unable to obtain that much blood. Emlyn held back his joy and agitation as he considered how he could resolve the negative effects. At this moment, Cosme turned to glance at him. The additional blood will be provided by the race. Then the problem turns into the modification of a bottle so as to carry around that much blood. Emlyn scanned the other sanguine who wore looks of envy and jealousy as he asked, "If I don't wear it, will I get the blood-thirsting disease?" "No." Cosme firmly shook his head. Emlyn stared at Lilith's ring and asked again, "If I were to wear it for 59 minutes and take it off, will I get the blood-thirsting disease?" Cosme's facial muscles twitched as he said, "When you wear the ring, you will be inflicted with the blood-thirsting disease. You have to drink 1 vial of human blood to have it subside for an hour. During this process, if you were to take it off and put it on again, the blood-thirsting disease will be activated again. Regardless of whether it's been an hour or not, you'll have to drink blood again. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Of course, this isn't a complicated problem," Emlyn said with a tsk. Cosme retracted his gaze and looked at the other sanguine. "I'll be giving this ring to the champion of this hunting competition, Emlyn White." "Congratulations, Emlyn." He turned and extended his right hand towards Emlyn to shake his hand. Then, he handed over the blood-colored Lilith's ring to Emlyn. "Thank you." Emlyn smiled in a reserved manner. Cosme stopped looking at him as he said to the other sanguine, "There are 2 targets left. They are your prey, and there will still be a reward for them." At 10 p.m., above the grey fog, Klein received Lamino's travels which Emlyn had sacrificed, and he learned of the usage of the so-called Lilith's ring. The other aspects aren't noteworthy, but the thing to pay attention to is the door of summoning which leads deep into the spirit world. Perhaps there will come a day when the one passing through that door is an ancient goddess, Lilith. Of course, many conditions need to be met. As Klein made a bold hypothesis, he flipped open Lamino's travels and checked the Beyonder powers which Emlyn had used and replenished. He used up all of the lightning strikes. Traveling is gone as well. This fellow really doesn't feel the pinch when using the powers of others. He added a Wings of Darkness. It can help the user receive an enhancement in speed and the ability of brief flight, as well as it transforming into a colony of illusory blood-sucking bats to attack the enemy. 1 is full moon. It can make a certain region appear to be in the state of a full moon. 1's spirituality would be rejuvenated and the aspect of death would grow stronger. This is recorded from Lilith's ring. 1 is claw of corrosion. It can cause one's fingernails to grow another segment with mysterious symbols and patterns. They would be sharp enough to slice through steel. It would also come with potent corrosive abilities, making it the nemesis of defensive methods like scales and skin. 1 is animal sense. It can communicate with animals and control them while also sharing their senses. If used well, this has wondrous effects. I've never seen Emlyn use it before. What a waste. 1 is Abyss Shackles. It's a spell belonging to the darkness domain. It can make the darkness or shadows condense into a chain that controls or restrains the enemy. There's no door of summoning. That's right. It should be very difficult to record. With Emlyn's personality, he would have given up after a few failures. As Klein flipped through Lameno's travels, he used divination and his mysticism knowledge to interpret the new Beyonder powers. Retracting his gaze, he summoned the sea god's scepter over, added a few pages of lightning strike. This was in line with his fear of lacking firepower. Then, Klein used the sun brooch to record holy light summoning and holy water creation, allowing Lameno's travels as Beyonder powers to become more varied. After doing all of this, he closed the notebook and picked up the mental terror candle. After settling the split personality in the afternoon, he didn't immediately return the mystical item. Instead, he had the idea that since it belonged to the spectator domain, it was possible that it could help him explore the sea of collective subconscious inside Grozel's travels. Therefore, he planned on delaying it for half a day before returning it to Emlyn. To his surprise, he found from his research that the mental terror candle didn't have any effects of placating the mind or eliminating negative emotions. All it could do was let one enter the depths of a target's mind, and from there, one could plant a cue or resolve a problem. Phew! Klein heaved a sigh of relief. Through the bestowment ritual, he returned the mental terror candle and Lameno's travels to Emlyn and Furs respectively. Returning to the real world, he had a comfortable bath, and he read some papers and magazines before heading to bed. Amidst his reverie, Klein suddenly woke up, aware that someone had entered his dream. He saw the scene before him change as the sky was dark and deep. They were adorned with resplendent diamonds that left him awed and serene. A distance away, a singing voice sounded. The ethereal and common voice reached straight into his heart. Meanwhile, the clouds moved as the crimson moon half revealed itself, scattering down its mild glow. All of this made Klein feel as though he had arrived in the Evernight goddess's divine kingdom. In the dream, he felt relaxed and comfortable. This is... Klein suddenly realized the situation he was in. This was the arrival of a Beyonder from the Church of the Evernight. This Beyonder was using the dream to placate the tycoon, Dwayne Dantes, so as to heal the mental scars he suffered in the afternoon. What you are doing only disturbs my sleep. Klein silently sighed helplessly. Chapter 804, Archaeological Team Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. As he sighed, Klein indulged himself by relaxing like an ordinary person enjoying a rare instance of serenity and comfort in his dream. After about 15 minutes, he finally waited to the point when the church's Beyonder that was sent to placate him had left. Finally. I can sleep in peace. Klein planned on opening his eyes out of habit before falling asleep again, but he realized that once he wasn't on high alert and on guard, the remnant sense of tranquility in his dream would allow him to directly fall into a deep slumber. That night, the quality of his sleep was extremely good, and he only managed to wake up at daybreak. Outside, the sun had just peeked out over the horizon, while the moon remained shining in the sky, and there was a slight howl from the winds. Klein lazily dazed in bed for nearly 10 minutes before picking up the golden pocket watch by his bedside table and snapping it open. It's not even 6:30. Should I roll over and continue sleeping, or should I wake up? Klein observed his physical condition and found his mind clear and brimming with energy. He didn't have any hint of feeling lethargic, so he decided to get out of bed to wash up before walking to his balcony to take a look at the orange vista. In this season, due to the wind, Backlund didn't have thick smog. Together with the environmental measures put into place over the past few months, the skies were often blue and the air fresh. The gardeners were already busy in the garden, and the parlor maid and handymen were heading to the market. Other than them, the surroundings were calm and peaceful. This invigorated Klein as he temporarily forgot all his troubles. He felt that the world belonged to him at that moment. With a faint smile, he silently enjoyed the scenery. In the next 15 minutes, servants would walk out from the surrounding houses in pairs or threes. They were either holding baskets or leading horses. The entire borough seemed to come to life as the sunlight grew brighter. This is what life should be like. Klein silently sighed as he had the sudden urge to take a stroll. He turned around and left the balcony and walked to the door. Outside the master bedroom, Richardson was already waiting outside. It was impossible to guess what time he had woken up. This was the most difficult thing about a valet. He needed to sleep later than his employer but also wake up earlier than him. There's another hour before breakfast. Sir, if you wish for it to be brought forward, the kitchen will be ready within 15 minutes. Richardson didn't ask Dwayne Dantes why he had suddenly woken up so early. Klein chortled and said, "There's no need to bring it forward. I plan on taking a stroll first." "Very well, sir." Richardson entered the bedroom, and based on his employer's suggestion, he chose a coat and helped him wear it. Finally, Klein wore a silk top hat and held a gold inlaid cane before walking down to the first floor. Leaving the residence, he strolled down the street that was lined with Intis parasol trees and black street lamps until he reached the other end. Along the way, each residence's garden emanated a faint fragrance as the green leaves of the trees created a sense of tranquility from high above. Pedestrians were in pairs or threes in what seemed like a sparse street. The occasional carriage that drove by would break the silence before quickly leaving. Klein enjoyed the morning, taking in the pleasantness of waking up early. He felt that the negative emotions from yesterday were evaporating bit by bit and vanishing. Beyonders need to learn how to create conditions for themselves to regulate their moods. By taking this stroll, the bishops at St. Samuel Cathedral will likely know that Dwayne Dantes has completely recovered. They won't disturb my sleep in the middle of the night. As Klein's thoughts wandered, his gaze swept past 39 Buckland Street. It was Member of Parliament Mock's residence. Its external perimeter was in the form of sharp iron rods, allowing passers-by to appreciate the beauty of the garden within through the gaps. While moving his gaze away, Klein saw a familiar figure. It was Hazel with her long black-green hair and dark brown eyes. This beautiful and proud lady was strolling through the garden's trails with her maid, looking around from time to time. She woke up early as well. Her quality of sleep is excellent because she doesn't need to head down the sewers in the middle of the night. Klein lampooned and retracted his gaze as he continued proceeding forward. Glancing at Richardson who was silently following behind him, Klein suddenly thought of the news reports, magazine articles, and novels he had recently read about the southern continent. He consciously kept up with the content of that region because that would flesh out his persona as Dwayne Dantes. After all, a lot of what he knew about the southern continent stemmed from the pirates, adventurers, and the Fog Sea's strongest hunter, Anderson. He had no idea if they were exaggerated or fabricated. The information I've read recently and in the past were about people who struck it rich in the southern continent before returning or had just decided to stay there. This makes Backland residents believe that there's gold everywhere in the southern continent, and that there are opportunities to strike it rich. Even common wood and sap can be used for many things, allowing one to exchange for plenty of pounds. That's why the kingdom frequently goes to war with countries like Faisac and Intis to vie for the colonial lands. If not for the commoners' inability to save up for the ferry tickets or dare to smuggle themselves there, I'm sure a large number of people would swarm it. As Klein's thoughts whirred, he casually asked his valet, "What's your impression of the southern continent?" He remembered that Richardson was born in a manor over there. He had only been brought to Backland when he was an adult. Richardson paused for a few seconds and said, "Sir, I actually do not know much about the southern continent because I was spending most of my time in the manor. I had few opportunities to head out. Just tell me of your impressions, your true impressions. You don't have to hold back. I just want to have a general understanding. As you know, they all believe me to be an expert of the southern continent, but in fact, my experiences are only limited to a few places and merchants," Klein said with a chuckle. Richardson nodded and bowed his head as he looked at his toes that were walking forward. "My impression of the southern continent is hunger, exhaustion, pain, as well as pining for the world after death." Hunger, exhaustion, pain. Klein repeated those 3 words as he walked into Buckland Street without making any further inquiry. East Chester County, in a building beside Stone University. Audrey was looking at the collections obtained by the Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. She had originally planned on coming on Tuesday afternoon, but Associate Professor Michel Duth had participated in an academic conference in Buckland, therefore only returning today. As a result, she had no choice but to change her plans. This pair of boots was discovered by a farmer in a mountainous ruins in Stone. Its shape and traits matched the societal trends of the Fourth Epoch. Michel introduced the item inside the glass cabinet to the beautiful aristocrat. Audrey looked over with interest and discovered that the ends of the boots were curled like a clown's. The heights of the curled parts weren't uniform. One was 3 centimeters, and the other was 5 centimeters. They didn't look like a pair. The Fourth Epoch's asymmetrical style. I wonder what level it is for 3 on the left and 5 on the right. Audrey retracted her gaze and followed Associate Professor Michel to the next exhibit. At the end of the tour, Michel pointed at the glass case diagonally ahead of them and said, "This coat of arms was delivered a few days ago. It involves the very ancient worship of dragons." Dragons. Audrey strode forward in a reserved manner and saw a grayish-white dragon with its wings spread out engraved on the coat of arms. "Where does it come from?" Audrey asked just as she did before. Michel answered, "It's from a village named Heartlark. This Loanese word doesn't have an archetype in ancient Fasak. Apparently, it was written like how it's read. Heartlark. That's the village which I previously visited that had the folk tradition of worshipping dragons. In the sea of collective subconscious of the people there's a mind dragon in it. The 20-year war notebook which I previously obtained from Associate Professor Michel was from a local knight named Lindalira. He was suspected to have something to do with that mind dragon." Audrey nodded in thought as she deliberated over her words, wishing to ask about the person who had found the coat of arms. At that moment, Associate Professor Michel's expression turned abnormally heavy. Accompanying the discovery of this coat of arms was a tragedy. A tragedy? Audrey didn't hide her surprise. Associate Professor Michel sighed and said, "An archaeological team entered the village to study the folk tradition of worshipping dragons, but that night, one of the members went mad. And this mental illness was apparently contagious. The entire archaeological team later went mad, killing themselves or each other. In the end, none of them survived. This coat of arms was found among their remains. It was first taken away by the police, and after confirming that it's without problems, only then did they donate it to us. An archaeological team entered the village, and the members went mad one after another." Audrey's eyes dilated as she inwardly repeated Associate Professor Michel's words. Suddenly, an idea came to mind. Psychology alchemists. The members of the archaeological team were members of the psychology alchemists. Inside the building of the Relic Search and Preservation Foundation, Audrey, whose thoughts were undergoing an upheaval, blinked. She took note of her body language and expressions as she drew a crimson moon on her chest in a half-genuine manner. She said with a sigh, "What a tragedy. I hope that their spirits can rest in peace." The reason she had guessed that the archaeological team had comprised of members of the psychology alchemists was that she had previously received a mission to help the organization obtain a notebook related to the 20-year war from Associate Professor Michel. And this notebook belonged to the knight from Heartlark Village, Lindalira. Back then, Audrey had made a request to Mr. Fool and relied on magic mirror divination to determine the origins of the notebook. She discovered that it was deeply connected to the village that worshipped dragons. As she knew ahead of time that there was a mind dragon hiding within the sea of collective subconscious, she ultimately chose to hand over the notebook to the psychology alchemists in consideration of her lacking sequence and strength. That also meant that the psychology alchemists had quite a significant chance of locking onto Heartlark Village through the notebook before heading over to find their target. Another factor that Audrey used in her judgment was the strange mental illness that the archaeological team suffered. It had spread like a plague, causing the people to go mad in batches. In the real world, there was a probability that mental illnesses were hereditary, but it was almost impossible to be contagious. But in the mysterious world, in the world of the mind and consciousness, chaos and madness could be spread to others through spirit channeling, dreams, and the subconscious. And hidden in Heartlark Village was a mind dragon that had lived for years. The psychology alchemists had found Heartlark Village through the notebook, and the threatened mind dragon used this ingenious method to spread mental corruption. He might have achieved this through the sea of collective subconscious. The Beyonder world sure is dangerous. This small team must have been formed by a selection of Beyonders, but they ended their lives in such a simple and ridiculous manner. As Audrey thought about it, she was glad that she had made a sufficiently rational decision. She hadn't willfully used the Knight's notebook to explore Heartlark Village. Otherwise, there would probably have been an addition named to the list of members who went mad. Thanks to Mr. Fool. Thanks to the other members of the Tarot Club. Thanks to Kalangos who previously infiltrated in disguise. They allowed me to still recognize the hidden dangers despite my lack of actual experience in the domain of mysticism. It made me sufficiently cautious. Audrey silently thought in gratitude. At that moment, her recalling her performance when she first joined the Tarot Club had made her wish to bury her head in her pillows to roar at herself, "Audrey, you were that naive and immature back then. Thankfully, you met Mr. Fool. If it were any other secret existence, you would have long gone mad or turned into a monster. Mr. Fool is such a nice man. No, such a nice orthodox god." By the side, Associate Professor Michel noticed that Audrey had been silent. He said with a heavy nod, "Yes, it truly is a tragedy that strikes one with fear. I only wish that the government has already handled the matter and prevented the contagious mental illness from becoming a plague. Don't worry, unless that mind dragon loses control and plans to challenge the three churches, there won't be any more victims of that mental illness." Audrey replied silently. From her point of view, the official Beyonders had already taken on the case. After all, a contagious mental illness was definitely going to be under the purview of the official Beyonders. Therefore, the dragon coat of arms in the glass case must have been determined to be fine before being donated to the foundation. The police department didn't have such authority. While Audrey felt pity for the archaeological team who were suspected to be psychology alchemists members, as though she had experienced the tragedy for herself, she was curious if the mind dragon remained in the vicinity of Heartlark Village. To hide in the sea of collective subconscious with one's actual body would probably make it difficult to be discovered. However, the three churches have a long history. In the fourth epoch or even earlier, they must have had bouts with mind dragons, so perhaps they have the corresponding records about it. Besides, the psychology alchemists is in control of the spectator pathway and has the existence of high-sequence Beyonders. Their comprehension of the sea of collective subconscious can't be much weaker than the mind dragons. After suffering a terrible failure due to the lack of information, they will definitely send a very powerful team. Although that mind dragon was stronger than what the psychology alchemists expected, it probably wouldn't stay there to be discovered. It should have left. Audrey made an inference based on what she knew. She didn't have any thoughts of visiting Heartlark Village to figure out the truth, because she long knew that the present her lacked the strength to deal with the mind dragon. Her only intentions were to mention the matter at the next Tarot Club, and see if the other members could provide any feedback or any valuable knowledge. For example, it might be that the mind dragon had entered the sea of collective subconscious because of the local worship of dragons, or it could be that the mind dragon's inhabitation of the sea of collective subconscious caused the villagers to dream of it, thus, being subconsciously influenced and having the tradition of worshipping the dragon. On Friday afternoon, Klein received the invitation list for the ball tomorrow. He began to seriously memorize the topics he needed to discuss with different guests. When meeting Member of Parliament mocked, I need to make remarks about the recent good air in Backland, and make a few jokes about the Lone Kingdom Imperial Science Institute. As Klein memorized each line, he suddenly heard stacked illusory please. A man. Based on how long it's been, it's most likely Mr. Hanged Man. In thought, Klein put down the piece of paper in his hand and gulped down a mouthful of black tea before leaving the half-open room with the big balcony to head for the master bedroom's bathroom. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog, and he discovered that it was indeed the Hanged Man. This man had requested the Honorable Fool to inform the world that he had arrived at the capital of the Rörsted Archipelago, City of Generosity, Byam. He could head for the primitive island in 2 days after he replenished his supplies. He wanted the world to begin preparations so that they could meet in time. He also indicated that if he lacked the means to head for the primitive, he could arrange for the world to secretly board the Blue Avenger. Board the Blue Avenger and bring a bunch of sailors from the Church of Storms to the vicinity of the primitive island. How long can the sanguine's anesthetic gas you bought from Emlyn last? Will there be enough time to explore? Klein thought for a moment and conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow, making him pray devoutly, "There's no need to go through that much trouble. You should have freedom of movement in Byam. Meet at the cemetery outside the city at midnight today. Before that, replenish your stores. Byam, in an inn." Alger frowned slightly after hearing the world Gehrman Sparrow's words. He did have freedom of movement in the City of Generosity. This was because the sailors were eager to head to places like the Red Theater. They were definitely not returning tonight, and after waking up in the day, it was almost certain that they would head to a casino to gamble to let themselves loose. It was to vent the repression and misery that resulted from drifting out at sea for extended periods of time. That also meant that even if Alger disappeared for a night and a day, no one would discover it. Is the world implying that we use this interval? That is indeed better than using the sanguine's anesthetic gas. I've already used it twice, so who knows if someone is already suspicious about it and is waiting for his theory to be validated. But without a ship, how do we head for the primitive island? Oh, Laymanos Travels. Miss Magician did mention that it has the beyonder power of teleportation. However, there's only 1 page, making it impossible for a return trip. Alger relied on his strong ability to connect matters to vaguely guess at Gehrman Sparrow's intent, but he believed that the necessary conditions were lacking. With these doubts in mind, he found his contact with the resistance and replenished his storm charms that were made with tin. When it was 11 at night, Alger secretly left his inn and headed out of the city under the shadows. He wasn't worried that the sailors would discover his disappearance because he too had physical needs. It was possible that he was sleeping in a lady's bed in the Red Theater and was unwilling to return. And there were many such brothels in Byam, with many prostitutes in existence. It was impossible to say that there was something wrong with him because he wasn't at the Red Theater. Once he left Byam, Alger walked on a narrow road where horse carriages couldn't pass as he headed for the mountainside of the mountain range beside the sea. Suddenly, his gaze froze as he noticed something. Under the crimson moonlight's illumination, the mountain that originally existed had vanished. And the area underneath, such as the piled stones, vegetation, and terrain, changed almost completely. This. Alger had come from the Resistance's private harbor earlier. He hadn't managed to pay close attention to the mountain, hence, he only noticed the abnormality at that moment. The mountain collapsed. It actually collapsed. Right, it was previously mentioned in the papers that Byam encountered a shallow earthquake, with its might being focused in the mountain range outside the city. Also, the church's deacon said that Gehrman Sparrow nearly destroyed Byam, and that matter had demigods involved. Both of them occurred during the same period. Could it be caused by Gehrman Sparrow? He instigated a demigod-level battle, and he managed to successfully escape while killing Admiral of Blood. Alger's pupils dilated as his footsteps slowed down to a halt. He suddenly understood why the Church of Storms had placed great importance on Gehrman Sparrow, and why he had a bounty worth as much as £50,000. In the undamaged cemetery up ahead, a cold wind blew across it and towards Alger in the silent night. It made him tremble involuntarily. At that moment, Alger's heart stirred as he turned his head to look right. Underneath a giant tree, a figure quickly outlined itself in the shade. This figure had his hand on his top hat while he slowly looked up, revealing a thin face and cut features. The emotionless dark brown eyes were none other than Gehrman Sparrow's. He did teleport over. How extravagant. Alger tensed up before relaxing, however, he did not let his guard down at all. Upon meeting Gehrman Sparrow again, he discovered that there wasn't much of a change to him. However, his every action had the indescribable air of a powerhouse, and the profundity he exuded left him apprehensive. As expected of the crazy adventurer who can instigate a battle of demigod proportions while escaping unscathed. The slight bit of smugness of having become a Sequence 5 vanished from Alger. He slowly walked over with lantern in hand. When he saw Gehrman Sparrow, he deliberately probed, the traces you left behind might not vanish for the next few centuries or even millennia. He was trying to confirm if the mountain's collapse had anything to do with Gehrman Sparrow. Klein shot a glance at the modified terrain as he released his grip on his top hat and smiled in a gentlemanly manner. The one who contributed the most in causing this damage was Sea King. Man, he actually triggered a demigod battle that could have destroyed Biam, causing Sea King to directly attack. Yet, despite such circumstances, he survived and left with Admiral of Blood. It's completely unimaginable and unbelievable. Alger began to suspect if Gehrman Sparrow had a Grade 1 sealed artifact on him, an item at the demigod level. He didn't express his shock and surprise, nor did he dare to probe further. Instead, he asked, "Do you plan on heading to that primitive island now?" "Of course," Klein answered calmly. It was late at night, a period when Dwayne Dantes was asleep. No one would disturb him, but he had to show himself once it was daytime. Of course, to prevent any unexpected circumstances, Klein had summoned a Rhodes to monitor the mirror illusion and provide a response. It's thanks to the Church of Evernight for having ended its dream treatment of Mr. Tycoon, otherwise, I would definitely have to delay the operation. Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Alger observed himself and discovered that he wasn't able to obtain any mystical item in such a short span of time. He then took out an iron-black ring that protruded out like a thorn and wore it on his left thumb. Bearing with the excruciating headache, he nodded slightly. "I hope for a pleasant partnership." Then, he saw Gehrman Sparrow walk over with a stoic expression, reach out his hand, and grab his shoulder. At that instant, Alger's first reaction was that Gehrman Sparrow was attacking him. He instinctively wanted to turn to the side to dodge his attack, only to recall his previous guess. Amidst his racing thoughts, he withheld his subconscious reaction and allowed the crazy adventurer to place his palm on his left shoulder. Right on the heels of that, he noticed Gehrman Sparrow's left hand turn transparent as though it was bearing the shadows of the spirit world. Then, the blacks before his eyes grew darker, and the crimson moon turned brighter. All kinds of colors seemed to layer upon one another. Countless nearly formless figures receded backwards as Alger tore through the spirit world with Gehrman Sparrow's help. Creeping hunger. Teleport. So that's how it is. Just as he had such a thought surface in his mind, he saw his body plummet as the saturated colors around him receded. Everything had returned to normal. Beach, reefs, trees. This is a deserted island. Alger surveyed the area and was just about to speak when the colors around him saturated as the layered phenomenon happened once again. This time, when he left the spirit world, he was in midair with undulating waves beneath him. Although Alger had never worked with Gehrman Sparrow in actual combat before, the experienced him immediately created a spiraling wind and allowed them to float. It was a tacit display of teamwork. Hence, the teleportation triggered successfully once again as Alger's and Gehrman Sparrow's figures rapidly phased away. When the surroundings were restored again, the two had arrived at the periphery of a gigantic island. There was a heavy mist in midair that the crimson moonlight was unable to fully penetrate. This not only failed to disperse the darkness in the forest and mountain, but it also added an eerie charm to it. "We're here," Alger said as he looked around. Klein wore an indifferent expression, but in fact, he was cautiously observing his surroundings. He found the place extremely quiet. There weren't any birds tweeting, wolves howling, or bugs chirping. It exuded a deathly silence. As though guessing his feelings, Alger raised the lantern and illuminated the shrubs ahead where there was a natural trail made up of beast-type footprints. He said, "If you come in the day, it will be quite a lively sight. You will even see birds that only exists in myths fly in the forest. But at night, the power that rules this place will change. Many beyonder creatures will hide as they await daybreak. Mr. Hanged Man has come here more than once. At the very least, he has the experience of a day and night here." Klein silently nodded without speaking further. Alger thought for 2 seconds and pointed ahead. "If we follow this trail and enter the dark forest all the way to the end, we will arrive at that ancient ruins of unknown age. On the way, we can hunt the beyonder creatures that we encounter and are able to deal with. If it's killed independently, the corresponding ingredients will belong to the killer. Those we jointly killed will be held in your custody. When we leave this place, we can take turns to choose. We will determine the owner based on our contribution, to decide who has the priority to choose, as well as the number of priority choices." Instead of being in a rush to take action, he first made clear the route and the plan to split the loot. It was to prevent any conflict that would result from the exploration. "To let me have custody of the loot we receive from a joint kill. Mr. Hanged Man is being very sincere." Klein raised his right hand and pressed down his half-top hat and chuckled. "No problem." Alger heaved a sigh of relief and continued, "Our main goal is to explore that ancient ruins. The spoils we obtain along the way are supplementary. Once we finish the exploration, it's best we leave immediately without heading to the other zones or taking other paths. As for anything in the future, it's up to you to decide when and where you would like to explore." Alger emphasized this matter because he was afraid of Gehrman Sparrow's greed. After all, beyonders were not perpetual machines. There was bound to be a point when they were exhausted. After a round of explorations, they were bound to be close to their limits. If they were to force themselves to hunt beyonder creatures in other zones, perhaps the identities of hunter and prey would switch. Even if the crazy adventurer was very powerful and unafraid of such danger, to be in a state of drained spirituality would trigger signs of losing control. "Do you think I'm not sharing the same thoughts as you? I'm the one worried that you be the one who's overly greedy, rashly proceeding deeper just to obtain more." Klein smiled and said, "I'm a polite person." "Polite?" Alger was a little puzzled by Gehrman Sparrow's choice of words. The corners of Klein's mouth curled as his expression turned darker in the darkness. When visiting someone's place for the first time, overstaying would be impolite. This fellow's train of thought and logical behavior is completely different from that of a normal person's. As expected of a crazy adventurer. Alger was first taken aback before he raised the lantern and took a step forward in the dim red shadows. "Let's set off." Klein allowed his hands to naturally droop down as he walked beside Alger like he was on a hike. The two quickly entered the dark forest that had nearly zero moonlight shining in. They saw that the trees were thick and tall with luxuriant leaves. Even the smallest trees were thicker than the span of a person's arm. And the trait they all had in common was that the bark appeared scaly. They were densely packed together as though they would come to life or squirm at any moment. "It's like a mutated Drago tree. A snake-scaled tree." Klein retracted his gaze and noticed the weeds at his feet that didn't seem problematic. None of them spoke as they maintained a state of abnormal silence. They didn't wish to say anything to eliminate the awkwardness just because it was too quiet. As they walked, the duo saw the distribution of trees ahead turn sparser thanks to the lantern's light. Thump. 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 A dull knocking sound echoed through the area. As Alger and Gehrman approached, it became clearer and more obvious. When the duo entered the sparse area, the lantern's light finally revealed hunched or prostrate figures. Amongst these figures were humans, baboons, goats, and tigers. They were either holding rocks or using their claws and teeth to constantly burnish the stacked trees and rocks as though they were building a palace. Without the obstruction from the luxuriant leaves, the crimson moonlight that penetrated the heavy mist cloaked these figures, dyeing them with a faint blood-red layer. There are humans. Klein's eyes focused as he immediately spread his left fingers. Alger slowed down, preparing his vocal cords to be activated at any moment. Suddenly, the figures seemed to sense something as they stopped their actions in unison before uniformly turning around to look at the two outsiders. They either had pale faces, withered skin, or festering bodies. None of them looked alive. Corpses. A beyonder creature is driving these corpses to build a palace for it. Klein cast his gaze past them and saw a dark cave that led deep into the ground. The surroundings were covered in weeds as white feathers stained with yellow oil scattered among them. Feathers. Corpses. These instantly reminded Klein of the products of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project, as well as the infectious aura that made him grow feathers. This zone's sovereign won't be weak. He calmly made a judgment. At that moment, Alger, who had carefully observed for a while, hesitated for 2 seconds before suggesting, "I've never seen such a situation before. I'm not sure of the level of the beyonder creature. Why don't we circle around it and choose a target which we have more confidence in?" His instincts told him that something extremely dangerous was hiding in the dark underground cave. "I was waiting for you to say that." Maintaining his persona as Gehrman Sparrow, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he chuckled. "Will this be impolite?" Just as he said that, the land quaked as though a creature beneath them was rolling over in its bed. Sensing the land quake, Alger's heart tightened as he glanced at Gehrman Sparrow, using his actions to replace his words. The sound of wind howled beside him, allowing him to run more easily and quickly to the side. The reason why Alger had done so was because he was worried that Gehrman Sparrow would suddenly go mad and decide to hunt the terrifying creature inside the dark underground cave. If that were to happen, even if they ultimately clinched a victory, it would have been extremely disadvantageous for the subsequent explorations. As an experienced sailor, he knew that decisive action spurred companions who remained indecisive into subconsciously following his actions. Upon seeing this, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he gave up the discussion about politeness. He widened his stride and ran behind the hanged man. Following that, he sensed a strong wind blow at his feet, thrusting him forward. This significantly reduced his need to overcome gravity, allowing him to obtain additional mobility that instantly doubled his speed. Amidst the rustling sounds, Klein and Alger ran out of the sparse woods and circled around the flank of the eerie darkness. At this moment, their heartbeats suddenly slowed. It was as though they hadn't been engaging in intense exercise and were instead in a state of reverie that resulted from the tanning of the afternoon sun. Klein immediately felt his body turn cold as an inexplicable and baffling sense of gloom arose as they tried invading his body. Meanwhile, he saw the light from Alger's lantern be swallowed inch by a gigantic black shadow. A corresponding scene naturally surfaced in his mind. In the depths of the dark underground cave, a thick, humongous serpent snaked out. It had dark green scales with exaggerated eyes that seemed to burn with fire. In between its scales were white feather covered in yellow oily stains. Along its back was a pair of thick wings that could be spread. While slithering and flying, this giant serpent raised its body high, coiling itself around a thick tree and extending its pitch-black tongue. It stared intently at the two figures that had barged into the surrounding area. Around it, the trees were rapidly withering along with the weeds. Countless corpses burrowed out of the soil as invisible shadows surged to its side. Feathered serpent. It was a feathered serpent. In the southern continent, it was a symbol of holiness. It was the emblem of the descendants of death, the Eggers family. Klein and Alger didn't pause as they held back the coldness of their bodies and their slowing heartbeats. Under the intense winds, they charged into the depths of the dark forest, pulling a distance away from the sparse trees. Badump. 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 The duo's heartbeats gradually returned to normal as the coldness of their bodies were dispersed by the heat generated from the intense exercise. Klein's spiritual intuition told him that the danger had passed. Hence, he slowed down his pace and turned to glance back. He said calmly while facing the depth of the darkness, "A demigod-level feathered serpent." Demigod level. Alger similarly slowed down as the blood vessel in his forehead pulsed. He paused for 2 seconds and exhaled lightly. "Don't worry about it. The Beyonder creatures here are very territorial. Unless they wish to hunt, they will not enter other zones, especially when it's near the mountain. That feathered serpent wouldn't chase after us." Klein nodded and said, "The Beyonder creatures here are very strong." Alger retracted his gaze and replied with a shake of his head. "No, there are also many weak ones. I've been here at night before, but I've only discovered the traces left behind by Beyonder creatures at the demigod level without encountering them. I actually encountered one this time. Such matters are mainly about luck. The chances of this happening again isn't too high. As a seafarer, being able to calculate was a necessary ability. Are you looking down on me, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck?" Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he said with a deadpan expression, "Absolute judgments often result in the opposite results." When translated into Earth speak, it was, "Don't raise death flags." In fact, if it wasn't a feathered serpent at the demigod level, and instead was something at sequence 5, Klein would be happy to bully it. After all, with Azek's copper whistle in hand, the Beyonder creatures in the death domain would lose at least half their combat strength. As for encountering a Beyonder creature at the demigod level, he wasn't too alarmed. This was because the Hanged Man had previously mentioned it, and he had made the corresponding preparations. He had the Fate Siphon Charm, 3 pages of demigod-level Beyonder powers in Lamino's travels, and the ability to travel. Although it wasn't necessarily the case that he could resist a demigod, it was enough to help him create opportunities to escape. "As long as I do not encounter angels," Klein silently added inwardly. After hearing Gehrman Sparrow, Alger was somewhat puzzled. This was because the crazy adventurer was clearly informing him to be more careful and cautious. A cold and crazy fellow? That's right. If he's just crazy, he wouldn't have lived to this day. Alger looked up at the sky as he tried hard to look past the mist and distinguish the blurry stars. After 2 minutes, he retracted his gaze and pointed in a direction. "We'll head in that direction." Klein had long drawn his iron-black death knell. He allowed the muzzle to naturally point downward as he silently followed alongside Alger. He wore a cold and composed expression that had no signs of anxiety. After traversing the extremely dim forest for some time, Alger suddenly stopped. As he looked to his left, he said in a deep voice, "If we head forward more, there will be an illusory chime tree. I hope to handle it by myself. The second Beyonder creature we encounter will be handled by you. I won't involve myself in the hunt. Unless you can't handle it alone." Alger swallowed the second half of his sentence. He wasn't like the hunters who were often seen at sea, people who often couldn't hold their tongues as they habitually said things that infuriated others. The main Beyonder ingredient which Miss Justice needs. Mr. Hanged Man has quite a bit of adventuring experience under his belt. He knows that being frank at times is more useful than concealing matters, and that negotiating is more effective than scheming. Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's persona as he nodded with a hint of gentlemanliness amidst his coldness. "Okay. If you can't deal with it, it's best you shout for help, otherwise, I'll treat it as your persistence." The style of a crazy adventurer appears to be different from hunters, but in certain aspects, they are surprisingly similar. Alger silently drew a breath as he continued forward with his lantern. As they walked, they heard weak chiming sounds, and they immediately felt as though they were home, their bodies and mind at ease. Klein acutely sensed that his wariness was melting away in an irreversible manner. No matter how much he emphasized it to himself, he was unable to tense up. At that instant, he even had the urge to head for the source of the chimes, believing that there was something extremely dear and familiar to him located over there. As they were quite a distance away, the chiming was sporadic. Klein was barely able to hold himself back as he turned to look at Mr. Hanged Man. Alger no longer looked as staid as before. The eyes of his rugged face were slightly red. It was unknown if he had recalled something that caused him to plunge into some emotional state. I wonder what Mr. Hanged Man looks like when he's crying. It must be quite terrifying. Klein couldn't help but muse. At this moment, Alger said softly with a hoarse voice, "Leave it to me." Just as he said that, he put down the lantern and slightly turned the sinister ring on his left thumb. He made the protruded thorn that looked like it was stained with old bloodstains turn brighter. This was his mystical item, Whip of Mind. Its side effects was to place the wearer in a state of a constant headache, one so bad that the wearer would yearn to slam their head into a wall. However, at that moment, the excruciating headache made Alger maintain his basic lucidity amidst the chimes without being truly hypnotized. At times, a side effect might actually provide benefits to the wearer. As Alger remained poignant, he took out a wooden box from his pocket and snapped it open. Inside it was a gray rat. Mr. Hanged Man wishes to use the rat as bait, so as to attract the illusory chime tree's attention before taking the opportunity to attack it. Not bad. He made adequate preparations. He already had a detailed plan ahead of time. As an experienced adventurer, Klein instantly guessed the Hanged Man's thought processes. Alger held up the rat and shook it when his expression suddenly turned odd. The gray rat was no longer moving. It wasn't breathing and was cold. It wasn't able to take on the responsibility of being bait. Back when they encountered the demigod-level feathered serpent, although Alger was in the periphery of the entity's focus and had escaped quickly without being overly affected, the gray rat he carried with him was only an ordinary animal. It didn't have a strong constitution and vitality, so it perished from the effects of the feathered serpent. It's dead. It's dead. Mr. Hanged Man now understands a principle: plans often can't keep up with change. His luck is mediocre. Upon seeing this scene, Klein couldn't help but twitch the corners of his mouth. He wanted to laugh, but he didn't make a sound, afraid that it would destroy his persona. Such situations were rare to the experienced and meticulous Hanged Man. Alger quickly reined in his emotions as he proceeded forward with the dead gray rat. Klein bent down and reached out for the lantern as he unhurriedly followed behind him. The chimes grew clearer as it made them more and more silent, with the urge to run towards it becoming greater. After taking another few steps forward, Klein finally saw that strange tree. Above its brownish-green trunk were thin cracks. Deep inside each crack was a darkness that looked as though different eyes were growing inside them. The branches that extended outwards had chime-like metal gray objects hanging from them. They were swaying automatically, letting out melodious sounds. And on the branch closest to the trunk, there was a fist-sized, colorless, translucent fruit. Alger stared in that direction as he pressed at his throat before saying to Gehrman Sparrow with a heavy voice, "It's best you cover your ears and converge your spirituality." Chapter 808, Awful Singing Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Upon hearing the Hanged Man, Klein's heart skipped a beat. He had an ominous premonition as he ignored his persona, put down the lantern, and took out 2 slips of paper. He then crumpled them into a ball and stuffed them into his ears. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow do it without any questions, Alger heaved a sigh of relief. He reflected on how nice it was to work with an experienced fellow. Even though he was an adventurer known to be crazy, he was someone who followed reasonable instructions. He knew what and what not to do. Just as he was about to throw the dead rat, which still retained some of its warmth, at the illusory chime tree to divert its attention, he suddenly saw the shrubs shake as a yellow-skinned, black-striped tiger appeared. Amidst the melodic chimes, the tiger walked towards the strange tree normally, but its eyes were glazed over. It felt indescribably creepy. When Alger saw this, he lowered his arm and abandoned his attempt of throwing the dead rat. Resisting the headache, he calmly watched as the tiger walked closer to the tree due to the growing influence of the melody. It crouched down, raised its right claw, and bared its claws, slicing itself at the neck. Despite the oozing blood, the tiger seemed to have lost all sense of pain. It continued digging in deeper, engorging the wound before it began to skin itself, revealing a naked body covered in mangled flesh and blood. The chimes gradually weakened as the branch suddenly came alive. It extended downwards, stabbing into the tiger's sorry, unprotected body. Alger, who was already prepared, immediately drew his dagger, opened his mouth, and sang hoarsely, "Break, break, break, on thy cold grey stones, O sea. Break, 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 at the foot of thy crags, O sea one." His voice had bold overtones, but it was completely out of tune. It was at complete odds with the comprehension of both humans and creatures. It was a jarring boom that had a metallic sound to it. It was filled with the power that left one frustrated and disgusted. Meanwhile, the illusory chime tree's branches trembled as they retracted like they were huddling together. Following that, a melodious chime lessened the terrifying noise to a small extent. At Alger's side, although Klein had used paper balls to stuff his ears and had converged his spirituality, he immediately felt his forehead's blood vessels throb. He instantly had the urge to kill the singer and destroy everything before him. Furthermore, his mind had the feeling of being ripped apart. His muscles and vessels were squirming as a result. Others charge people money to sing, but Mr. Hanged Man's singing charges you with death. Klein lampooned as he resisted the irascibility in his heart. Break! 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 Every word Alger said burst out like waves striking reefs. Bolts of silver lightning descended in turns, as though in euphoric praise. As silver flashes lit up one after another, they smote down at the illusory chime tree's surface, causing it to tremble incessantly. Its branches shook in a numb and random manner, making it difficult for it to produce the melodic hypnotic music. Alger took this opportunity as he threw the dead rat and thrust the dagger in his hand forward. With a howling wind, invisible blades swooshed over, slicing at the branch at the top and nearest to the illusory chime tree's trunk. Gotcha! The colorless, palm-sized, translucent fruit fell as it was swept up by a gust of wind and flew into Alger's palm. The tree bark, which was covered with eye-like cracks, froze as the remaining branches drooped down, having lost their ability to move. Indeed, as long as you gather the correct intel ahead of time, beyonder vegetation at the same level is a lot easier to deal with than animals due to its lacking intelligence. Alger took out a golden container he had prepared, and he put away the illusory chime tree's fruit. Then, he turned around to look at Gehrman Sparrow. "Let's continue." He suddenly stopped speaking as the word "forward" vanished from his vocal cords. At that instant, he saw Gehrman Sparrow's cold expression looking somewhat warped. The whites around his brown irises were slightly red, as though he would unleash an attack upon him at any moment. Alger felt tense as he slowly drew a gasp and completed his sentence. "Let's continue forward." "Let's go," Gehrman Sparrow replied softly. He first circled around the withered illusory chime tree and walked deep into the dark forest. He didn't get any bark, branches, or materials that were rich in spirituality, because they were bound to encounter many beyonder creatures later. Furthermore, he didn't have any so-called storage artifacts. Naturally, he left whatever space he had for worthwhile spoils. Besides, having too many things on him would only weigh him down and prevent him from fully displaying the agility of a clown. Unfortunately, those are materials without any vitality or blood, making it impossible to enter Grosel's travels. I can let my marionette bring them in, but that will be very troublesome and detrimental to the subsequent exploration. As Klein sighed, he calmed his mind, extricating himself from the remnant effects of the hanged man's singing. This was the most jarring and terrible singing that he had heard in both his lives. If the hanged man continued for another 1 or 2 minutes, he couldn't guarantee that he could stop himself from beating him up. Using just paper balls to stuff my ears and converging my spirituality can only weaken the effects. There's no way to really block it out. Even a deaf person can hear it. This includes an exchange at the spirituality level. This is probably the most indefensible attack from an ocean songster. Furthermore, there's no way of dodging it once it happens. There's only lightning strike which can be dodged ahead of time. This is a rather powerful sequence 5 as well. However, why does Mr. Hanged Man's singing feel completely different from elvish songster Ciata's? As Klein summarized and analyzed his experience, he was somewhat puzzled. At this moment, the lantern-holding Alger, who was walking beside him, couldn't help but consider a question: even Gehrman Sparrow can't stand my singing. How should I act as an ocean songster? In that silent environment, the two quickly proceeded forward amidst thick trees that appeared to be covered in snakeskin as they approached the ancient ruins. With a seafarer beside him, Klein saved himself the trouble of using dowsing rod seeking. He focused on watching out for any sudden attacks. The dark and silent environment resembled a horror story. As the two proceeded forward for an unknown amount of time, they discovered that the trees were beginning to systematically become sparse. This was completely different from the situation back when they met the demigod-level feathered serpent. The trees there had abruptly become sparse, while what they were encountering now was a progressive change. It made them have the misconception that they were about to leave the dark forest. After passing through this zone, we will arrive at the periphery of the ancient ruins. Alger broke the silence. He paused and then added seemingly casually, based on my experience, it becomes more dangerous as we approach it. The signs of a demigod creature I found last time was around here. However, oddly, the periphery of the ancient ruins doesn't have any signs of beyonder creatures. However, I have no idea about deep inside it. This is probably because there's an even more terrifying existence inside the ancient ruins. That zone is its territory, so other creatures do not dare to approach. Klein mumbled inwardly. He had a sense for the danger level of this expedition. He had previously performed the corresponding divination above the grey fog, and the revelation he received was that it had its ups and downs, as well as its problems. However, leaving safely wasn't much of a problem. After the Hanged Man said that, Klein chuckled. You likely know what my guess is. He didn't say anything further as he entered the zone with sparse vegetation. Alger silently walked beside him, increasingly convinced about his judgment of Gehrman Sparrow. He was calm and crazy. After proceeding dozens of meters forward, they suddenly saw a pair of ghostly blue eyes situated at where the lantern's glow could reach. It was a black baboon crouched on a branch. Its fur was naturally curled, and its head grew black crystals. These crystals grew upwards in a random manner, forming a strange crown. Upon seeing the black baboon, Klein and Alger simultaneously had the urge to bow their heads to not look directly at it. They felt as though it was the ruler of the nearby region, their sovereign. Sovereign. Alger relied on the excruciating headache which the whip of mind brought him in order to escape its influence as he hurriedly took a step to the left in an attempt to avoid any direct clashes. He left the unknown beyonder creature to Gehrman Sparrow. They had agreed to it prior. However, despite walking to the left, he ended up walking forward. His legs also hobbled as though he suddenly needed crutches. Subconsciously, Alger drew his dagger, causing sharp wind blades to swish towards the curly-haired baboon. At that moment, the baboon grinned. The wind blades suddenly changed direction in midair, moving in every direction at random to perfectly avoid hitting the target. Upon seeing this scene, Klein gave up his plans on approaching through ordinary methods. His left glove instantly turned transparent as he turned invisible. Alger stopped his actions that resulted from his stress when he saw Gehrman Sparrow in his top hat appear behind the black curly-haired baboon. The distance between them was less than 5 meters. Right on the heels of that, the black curly-haired baboon's body abruptly stiffened as though it lost control of most of its body. It even tried hard to raise its palm, trying hard to dig at its eyes in an attempt to distort something. And at this moment, Gehrman Sparrow had already made use of this delay to raise the iron-black revolver in his right hand, aiming the dark barrel at its head. Then, without any emotion, the crazy adventurer pulled the trigger. Chapter 809, The Danger Amidst the Darkness. Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Bang. The loud gunshot reverberated in the sparse and open region as they extended outwards. If it was an ordinary island with an ordinary forest at night, it would have alarmed the birds and beasts, sending them scattering away. But here, everything remained quiet, so quiet that it didn't seem like any living creatures existed. As for that black curly-haired baboon, its head had burst open, splattering blood and brain matter everywhere like it was raining. The black crystal at its head shattered as well, with not a single piece remaining intact. Klein bent his arm and slowly retracted Death Knell, which was still spewing out smoke. He watched as the mutated curly-haired baboon's stocky body, one more that was muscular than a human's, collapsed to the group. By approaching with traveling, forcefully controlling with wraith, and seizing the opportunity to deal a lethal strike with Death Knell, it was an instant kill. Klein wasn't doing this to flaunt his strength, but via his observations, he believed that the mutated curly-haired baboon had unique powers. If he didn't quickly finish it off while it didn't understand anything about him, there was a very high chance that the situation would be reversed, making the battle rather tricky. Besides, on such a dangerous primitive island, it was imperative he avoided situations from escalating, for no one knew what things could be lured by an intense battle. Therefore, after Klein possessed the mutated curly-haired baboon with a wraith, he gave up on the more reliable and more unnoticeable method of controlling spirit-body threads, because it took longer. Instead, he chose to cock the gun and use Death Knell to finish it off while it was stiff and slow as a result of the wraith's influence. The effects were identical to his expectations. The possible accidents that could happen midway were as he imagined. With the help of distortion and chaos, the mutated curly-haired baboon did possess the ability to extricate itself from the unfavorable situation of the wraith's possession, and it would allow the bullet's trajectory to violate the laws of physics and avoid its body. Unfortunately, its efforts had come to an abrupt stop before it could change any effects. Klein had seized that brief moment of sluggishness to decisively deliver the lethal strike. If he had switched to controlling spirit-body threads, the outcome might have been very different. It's worth it to suffer a weakness for this. Furthermore, there's a higher chance of me being needed to use Death Knell later. Compared to realizing what I'm afraid of in a more dangerous environment, it's better to know the problem ahead of time and avoid similar situations. That's the better option. Klein allowed his revolver to point downward as he walked to the side of the mutated curly-haired baboon. At this moment, under the wraith's control, the Beyonder characteristic of the Beyonder creature rapidly appeared. Alger held up the lantern as he watched this scene from a distance away. It took him nearly a minute to snap back to his senses. Frozen in his mind was ultimately the scene of the flare from Gehrman Sparrow's muzzle and the bursting head of the curly-haired baboon. The chaos they encountered in the beginning had made him understand that the Beyonder creature they had encountered was at a sequence higher than that of the illusory chime tree. It was a relatively difficult creature to deal with, one that required sufficient caution during combat. Furthermore, there wasn't any guarantee of victory. Yet, Gehrman Sparrow had finished the battle in 3 seconds. The speed at which it happened was as though he was engaging in target practice. Being a sequence 5 Beyonder as well, the difference was unbelievable. Combining a short-distance teleportation ability and a strange power that can control an enemy for a certain amount of time, along with that astoundingly potent revolver, the effects are unimaginable terrifying. If I were to encounter it for the first time, I would definitely be killed instantly. And even if I'm prepared, it wouldn't be easy to resist it. The best solution is to use my singing to affect my surroundings indiscriminately. It will prevent Gehrman Sparrow from successfully completing a teleport. As expected of a crazy adventurer with a bounty of £50,000. Even without Mr. Fool's help, just him alone isn't weaker than Admiral Hell. It's possible that he's even stronger. While sighing poignantly, Alger reined in his thoughts as he considered how he could deal with the situation if he were in the curly-haired baboon's shoes. Compared to the descriptions from others and his own guesses, witnessing it himself was more convincing and shocking. Inside the corpse of the curly-haired baboon where the shattered black crystal was, a faint blob of light quickly appeared and converged together, turning into a translucent, pitch-black fist that was tightly clenched. Indifferently to their thoughts, the fist produced a feeling of strength and sinisterness. The palm's lines, luster, and fingernails seemed to follow ordinary principles, but they were filled with an abnormal charm. It seemed to hide large amounts of madness and chaos. Sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion from the Black Emperor Pathway. I wonder what weakness I received. I hope it's not too odd. I can use Death Knell as much as I want in the next 6 hours. As Klein muttered, he bent down to pick up the Beyonder characteristic and stored it in a prepared metal container. In fact, he could attempt to graze the curly-haired baboon and see if he could obtain the corresponding Beyonder powers of a Mentor of Confusion so as to swap away his gloves barren of corruption. But ultimately, he gave up on that idea since he wasn't sure what the Beyonder creature had done that made it deserve such torture. His encounter had been an encounter on a battlefield. Ensuring his enemy's death was nothing out of the ordinary, but grazing was an extremely excruciating pain that left a soul yearning for liberation. Klein had his own principles and stubbornness. He didn't easily violate them, and he often cautiously chose his targets. Of course, to him, creatures of lower intelligence were not the same as humans. Even if he attempted to graze it, it wasn't crossing the line. However, many of his past experiences told him that persisting to keep to his principles and not relax the requirements for himself was not only a moral question but was something to prevent himself from losing himself. He couldn't keep pushing the envelope just because he thought it was nothing. As the trivialities accumulated, it would eventually result in a terrible mistake. In this crazy and chaotic mysterious world, actions aren't for others to see, but for myself. A person can fool humans and even deities, but they can't fool themselves. I wonder if high-sequence Beyonders from the Spectator Pathway can fool themselves. As Klein's thoughts raced, he took out Grozel's travels that he hid near his chest, intending to smear the curly-haired baboon's blood over its cover. At that moment, his heart tensed up as the hair along his neck stood up. This was an intense premonition of danger. And in this premonition, no scene had surfaced in Klein's mind. Not good. Klein instantly found his heart wrapped in layers of shadows as everything before his eyes seemed to be covered in a layer of dark glass. Without the luxury of time to consider what was happening, the glove on his left palm turned transparent once again. His figure turned invisible before he appeared beside Alger, reaching out to grab his shoulder. At that instant, Alger also sensed the abnormality. His heart contracted and expanded like the source of a storm as his blood surged through his veins and arteries like a tidal wave. Meanwhile, he saw Gehrman Sparrow's right hand which was grabbing his shoulder. From the fingernails, it was turning gray and turning dull, bit by bit, just like any stone that could be found anywhere in the dark forest. And his feet, knees, and muscles were turning stiff as though they no longer belonged to him. The two figures quickly turned transparent as they vanished from their location and entered a saturated and clearly overlapped spirit world as they quickly traversed it in the direction of the ancient ruins. Suddenly, the red, green, black, and other stacked colors before Klein's eyes uniformly darkened as they produced fine patterns that resembled raven black hair. Raven black hair. A chill rose up from their souls as Klein didn't hesitate to leave the spirit world with the hanged man and return to the real world where they landed in an area mixed with rubble and weed. Not far away was a mostly collapsed building. Through the corner of his eye, the hanged man had already turned grayish-white from the waist down, as though he had turned into a stone sculpture. "Pah!" Klein snapped his fingers, igniting the grass tens of meters away in preparation to leap over. At that moment, he suddenly felt his heart palpitate as his body began to tremble involuntarily. The appearance of the soaring flames was terrifying to him. The weakness Death Knell gave him this time, fear of fire. Seeing the dark glass thicken before his eyes, Klein felt a howling wind sweep him up from below before he could overcome the fear, causing him and Alger to fly up, passing through the invisible border and entering the vicinity of the ancient ruins. Bang! The duo fell to the ground simultaneously, producing the sound of crashing rocks. The thick shadow over their hearts vanished as the danger that hid in the darkness receded like the tide. Phew! Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he saw the grayish-white color that had spread to his elbow turn faint and recede. He felt his physical condition was rapidly recovering after he left that zone. His back was covered in perspiration that soaked his shirt. And what left him most horrified was that he didn't know what monster had attacked him or what powers were used. Did Death Knell's gunshot alarm some monster in the vicinity, or is it the existence that rules over this forest at night? Thankfully, it doesn't dare to enter the vicinity of the ancient ruins. This isn't necessarily good. This means that deep in the ancient ruins is something that makes it fearful. I should be prepared to retreat at any moment. Klein stretched his hands and slowly stood up. At this moment, Alger escaped from that grayish-white layer as he turned his head to glance over. That zone was petrifying us. That zone. Petrification. Klein nodded in thought as he walked towards the mostly collapsed building that was strewn with weeds and covered in vines. He then replied in a deep tone, "The problem now lies ahead." Alger didn't speak further as he sped up his pace, steadily walking by his side. After approaching, Klein looked at the building. His gaze swept the spires and stone columns, as well as the damaged walls that remained standing. He stopped and asked seemingly casually, "What kind of building do you think this ruin was in the past?" Alger remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Cathedral." A cathedral. Chapter 8:10, Whose Cathedral Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios, A Cathedral. We came to the same judgment. Klein looked at the ruin ahead of him as he silently muttered to himself. At that moment, the tiny amount of crimson moonlight that penetrated the mist had scattered onto the collapsed building. Compared to before, it was a lot richer in color, almost approaching the color of blood. Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's trademark cold attitude as he said in an unperturbed manner, "Where did you previously explore?" As he spoke, Klein glanced at the lantern in the hanged man's hand which remained unshattered despite all the ordeals. He subconsciously tensed up his muscles and skin when he saw the glow from the flame. Although the flame was ultimately contained by thick glass and metal frame, it still left him a little afraid. Alger didn't notice the minute changes in Gehrman Sparrow as he raised his dagger-wielding right hand and pointed at the grandest building amidst the ruin. There. All that was left of the building was its main structure. It was impossible to know what it originally looked like. The only things that could only be determined were that it had thick walls with narrow windows, and the building's scale and its magnificence. Furthermore, it once had a spire and clock tower. It had a Spartan facade and an ancient architecture. This is an architectural style from the early 4th epoch. There are records of these in the Church of Storm's canon. It's said that in that period, the various churches used such styles to build their cathedrals in a widespread fashion. Alger had a deep impression on the ruin. Over the years, he had flipped through many books and had acquired quite a bit of the background. Its greatest trait is the temple found above and the catacombs found below. Life and death were both unified here. However, I cannot confirm that the ancient cathedral's interior is as I described, as I've never ventured deep into it. This might be an architectural style left behind from the 3rd epoch. Klein made a guess as he walked straight to the opening of the ancient cathedral ruin's abnormally huge door. By keeping the lantern behind him, enjoying only the light emitted from it, he didn't need to suffer from his fear of fire. The duo quickly moved up the grayish-white stairs that were ridiculously high, and they arrived at the door's opening. Inside, they saw remnants of stone columns and arches that extended upwards towards the center. Klein wasn't in a rush to enter. He reached his left hand into his pocket and took out a gold coin as he allowed it to weave between his finger while seemingly muttering something. Suddenly, He flipped the gold coin and opened his palm to await its descent while saying to the hanged man, "How did you determine that deep in this cathedral is something of value that is not less than that of the cards of blasphemy?" After he said that, he looked at the gold coin that had fallen into his palm before putting it away. Alger pointed inside and said, "I've said before that my strength was inferior to Kalango's, and I didn't go as deep as he did. I had no idea what he saw, other than the judgment that there was something extremely precious and important inside from his remarks. Furthermore, it was something that only a true sequence 5 could obtain. However, the murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground might be able to explain something." Klein nodded and walked through the dark door's opening that the crimson moonlight was unable to illuminate. The black trench coat he wore fluttered gently behind him as Alger held up a lantern and clenched his dagger while following behind. Passing through the opening, Klein used the crimson moonlight that shone in from the opening at the dome to see the hall of considerable depth up ahead. A few of the ancient stone columns supporting it had already snapped. At the end wasn't an altar, nor were there any staircases that led upwards. It was completely dark and difficult to tell the details. It appeared as though it led underground. It isn't a temple above and a catacomb beneath. The temple is underground in the catacombs. It's impossible to determine that. We'll know only by venturing down. Klein subconsciously glanced around and discovered side doors along the two sides, but the regions they led to had already completely collapsed with no usable path. The murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground, he recalled what the hanged man had just said, and he took 2 diagonal steps before releasing the invisible Wraith Seigneur. With his night vision, he began observing the remaining murals. The mural's background was of a towering and magnificent mountain. At its peak was a gigantic cross that was covered in a lustrous glow. In front of the cross were grand and abnormal figures that were clustered around. They were angels with 2 wings, 4 wings, or 6 wings. This. Klein did a cursory glance and felt a strong sense of familiarity. He had seen a similar mural before, back in Blasphemer Amon's mausoleum. When he focused again, Klein quickly noticed the difference. There weren't the 2 infants that represented Amon and Adam, nor were there any 12-winged angels. The grand figure in front of the cross held its arms to its chest as it held an ancient, Spartan slate. The slate was drawn in an extremely indistinct manner, yet, it felt both ancient and young, holy and sinister. It was in extreme contradiction. Slate. Klein's pupils dilated slightly as a specific term flashed in his mind, blasphemy slate. This is likely that ancient sun god, the Lord that created everything which the City of Silver worships. Indeed, the blasphemy slate is closely related to him. I wonder if this is the first blasphemy slate or the second. Klein roughly guessed at the cathedral's worshipped entity, and he also began to believe that the depths of the ruin hid items that were very valuable and important. He withdrew Seigneur's gaze and allowed the marionette to turn to face the ground. Apart from the slates being covered in cracks and some odd marks remaining, they were dark red in color, smaller than a human's forehead. They overlapped with one another at times as they extended all the way to the ends of the hall. At that instant, a scene naturally appeared in Klein's mind. Devout believers were prostrated on the ground as they proceeded forward, slamming their foreheads heavily onto the ground after covering a certain distance, leaving blood oozing out. Noticing Gehrman Sparrow look around without any scrutiny, Alger probed, the ancient sun god. At that moment, he felt the baffling sensation of a cold wind blowing from Gehrman Sparrow's side. He suspected that hidden around them were shadows or wraiths. Recalling the strange restraints the mutated curly-haired baboon was under, Alger made a vague theory that he didn't voice out. Upon hearing the hanged man's question, Klein had wanted to chuckle and reply, "You can also call him the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God," but he felt that such a tone and choice of words was closer to that of the fool and not Gehrman Sparrow. Hence, he held himself back and nodded slightly. "It's not hard to tell." Alger silently heaved a sigh of relief as he held a sense of anticipation for the item buried deep underneath the cathedral. The two simultaneously decided to walk towards the end of the hall. When they approached it, Klein finally saw the staircase that led downwards. An underground area? He asked succinctly. Alger shook his head. I can't be sure. I've never gone down. Although Kalangos had attempted to venture in, he returned in less than 10 minutes with his aura becoming relatively weak. Klein nodded thoughtfully and said in passing, you seem to be very familiar with him. If it were said by anyone else, Alger would have pretended to have not heard it or answer directly. But deep in his heart, the world German Sparrow was Mr. Fool's blessed. His question could possibly represent the intentions of that existence, so he needed to view them seriously. After deliberating for a few seconds, Alger said in a deep voice, we were fellow townsmen, and we were servants at the same cathedral. The priest there was an easily irritated person who enjoyed punishing the servants. Kalangos couldn't bear it and escaped secretly to become a pirate. So there was such a past. Mr. Hanged Man is also a man with a story. Klein didn't probe deeper as he headed down the staircase in the extremely silent cathedral ruins. Although his footsteps were extremely light, they still sounded obvious in such an environment as they echoed. Soon, the two of them came to the end of the staircase and saw the opening of an arched door. On both sides of the opening were two shadows that stood there silently in an immutable fashion. Klein and Alger halted at the same time as they looked at the two shadows, only to discover that they were two stone statues. They were both men with their surface being grayish-white. One of them wore full-body armor that resembled a barrel, and the other wore a jacket that looked more contemporary. Their expressions were writhing in pain as their eyes protruded as though they were glaring at something. Upon seeing this scene, Klein realized something as he recalled the encounter outside. He and Alger had also shown signs of petrification, and it was thankful that they extricated themselves of the effects, or they might have really become statues. Don't tell me they're humans who met with the same situation. If we had been petrified, would we be moved down here, standing guard at this door opening for centuries or even millennia? The source of that petrifying power isn't afraid of these ruins. Klein felt explicable horror as his scalp tingled. He controlled his emotions and turned his head to look at the hanged man. He discovered that the pupils of the boorish man at sea had similarly dilated and was clutching the dagger tightly. Mr. Hanged Man has come to the same conclusion without me needing to speak further. Klein pointed at the door opening and said, there might be even more stone statues inside. Alger nodded as he said worriedly and jokingly, let's hope we don't see ourselves. If we're convinced that we have escaped the effects of petrification, only to see our statues in this underground area, that would be quite the horror story. Klein thought for 2 seconds and said to the hanged man, do you have night vision? His true meaning was that the light of the lantern was especially eye-catching in the dark catacombs and that it might easily cause unwanted developments. Therefore, it was best to extinguish the flame if he had night vision. And he believed that Mr. Hanged Man was able to read in between the lines. Alger replied frankly, yes. As a beyonder of the sailor pathway who could dive, it was a given that he had night vision. Klein glanced at him without a word, but his meaning was obvious. Then why are you still using a lantern? Alger seriously replied, firstly, it's to misdirect the enemy into instinctively believing that I don't have night vision because of my use of a lantern. When they destroy my lantern and try hard to create a dark environment, I'll give them a pleasant surprise. How sinister. Klein was momentarily at a loss for words. Alger continued, secondly, it's to avoid situations similar to the City of Silver. There might be extreme darkness lurking within complete darkness. Makes sense. Klein didn't insist that Alger extinguish the lantern as he first stepped past the two stone statues. Under their pain-frozen gazes, he stepped into the entrance that led underground. As he didn't know what the petrified statues represented, nor did he know if they were completely dead, Klein didn't attempt to shatter them to obtain their beyonder characteristics and mystical items.